They called it madness the first time they heard it. The runway at RAF Manston looked less like an airfield and more like a battlefield. Craters split the concrete into jagged sections. Smoke drifted low across the field after another Luftwaffe raid. Ground crews filled holes with gravel during the night, only to watch fresh explosions tear them open again by morning. Aircraft sat scattered along the edges of the strip, some intact, others burned hollow from the inside out. Engines without wings. Wings without fuselages. Machines frozen halfway between usefulness and ruin. And in the middle of all this chaos, one RAF officer proposed that fighters should begin their takeoff roll by moving backward first. Not taxiing backward, launching backward, at least for a moment. The idea sounded absurd, even dangerous. Pilots were trained to simplify takeoffs, not complicate them. Every instinct drilled into a combat aviator said that an aircraft should face forward, accelerate smoothly, and leave the ground as quickly as possible. Introducing reverse motion into that sequence seemed reckless. The airfield engineers listening to the proposal exchanged skeptical looks. One mechanic laughed openly. But Flight Lieutenant Peter Townsend did not present the idea emotionally. He presented it mathematically, and mathematics was harder to dismiss. The summer of 1943 was becoming one of exhaustion for southeastern England. German raids against RAF stations along the coast intensified as the air war over Europe expanded. Fighter fields close to the Channel carried a constant burden. Aircraft launched daily to intercept raids, escort bombers, patrol shipping lanes, and defend coastal sectors. The pace never truly stopped. Manston occupied an especially dangerous position, close enough to occupied France that enemy aircraft could reach it quickly. Flat terrain, limited room, minimal protection. Pilots sometimes described it as an aircraft carrier built out of dirt and concrete because the margin for error felt just as small. Damaged aircraft limped toward it because there was nowhere safer nearby. But the field itself was deteriorating under pressure. Bomb craters destroyed normal takeoff procedures. Pilots had to weave around damage while accelerating. Temporary repairs failed constantly. Steel matting buckled under heavy wheels. Rain collected inside holes and weakened the surface beneath. Every launch became unpredictable, and unpredictability kills pilots. Townsend understood that the most dangerous part of any emergency scramble was not combat in the sky. It was the vulnerable seconds spent accelerating down a damaged runway while enemy bombers closed overhead. An aircraft during takeoff occupies a terrible middle ground. Too fast to stop safely, too slow to fly, unable to evade, unable to defend itself. A single bomb landing near the aircraft during those seconds could destroy both machine and crew instantly. So Townsend began studying the geometry of the problem instead of the tradition surrounding it. He walked the runway after raids, counting paces between craters. He watched how pilots aligned themselves before takeoff. He measured acceleration distances and noted how much runway was wasted simply getting aircraft positioned correctly before power was applied. Eventually, he reached a conclusion that sounded irrational until it was drawn on paper. The fighter did not need to begin its launch from a static forward position. If the aircraft rolled backward first, even briefly, the pilot could pivot immediately into alignment and begin acceleration from a more efficient angle while already carrying motion. The exposed takeoff roll would shorten dramatically, only by seconds. But in wartime, seconds become survival. Townsend brought the calculations to Wing Commander Hugh Verity. Verity was not a dreamer. He had seen too many pilots die for romantic theories. He listened without interruption while Townsend explained the maneuver step by step. Reverse roll, brake, pivot, throttle, launch. The numbers suggested the exposed runway time could be reduced by nearly half under ideal conditions. Verity studied the diagrams silently. Finally, he asked only one question. "Can you prove it?" Townsend answered immediately. Yes. The test was arranged quietly. No publicity. No observers beyond essential ground crew. If the maneuver failed, the RAF preferred not to explain why one of its pilots had attempted something so unconventional. The morning chosen for the first trial was cold and gray. Frost clung to the edges of the runway. Wind from the north sea cut sharply across the field. Somewhere beyond the clouds, the war continued unseen. Townsend positioned his Supermarine Spitfire facing the wrong direction. Even motionless, it looked unnatural. Pilots nearby stopped what they were doing to watch. Townsend climbed into the cockpit calmly. He checked the controls. Ignition, rudder, brakes, throttle. Then he started the Merlin engine. The aircraft vibrated violently as the engine roared awake. He released the brake carefully. The Spitfire rolled backward across the damaged surface. Slowly at first. Awkwardly. Tail wheels were never designed for this kind of movement. Every instinct in Townsend's body urged correction. But he ignored instinct and trusted procedure. 15 yards. 20. Brake. Now came the critical moment. Townsend applied rudder and asymmetric throttle simultaneously. The fighter pivoted sharply across the rough ground, nose swinging around toward the runway in one clean movement. The instant alignment completed, he advanced throttle to full power. The Merlin screamed. The Spitfire surged forward immediately, already loaded with motion from the pivot. Acceleration came faster than in a normal takeoff. The tail lifted almost instantly. 40 knots. 50. 60. Townsend pulled back gently on the stick. The aircraft lifted cleanly into the gray sky. Total exposed acceleration time, 8 seconds. Nearly half the normal requirement. When he landed, the mechanics waiting near the edge of the field no longer laughed. Verity reviewed the results in silence. Then he ordered more tests. Not because he fully trusted the maneuver yet, because he could no longer afford to ignore it. Over the next several days, Townsend repeated the launch under different conditions, different wind directions, different runway surfaces, different aircraft weights. The results remained consistent. The maneuver shortened takeoff exposure significantly without sacrificing stability once airborne. Other pilots began volunteering to try it. Some adapted quickly. Others struggled badly with the pivot timing. Too much rudder caused over-rotation. Hesitation during throttle application ruined the momentum advantage. A few nearly lost control entirely during early attempts. But each repetition refined the process. Townsend adjusted the geometry slightly, depending on runway condition. Ground crews painted temporary marker lines onto the damaged strip to help pilots identify optimal braking points. Mechanics measured distances between craters so pilots could avoid unstable surfaces during the reverse roll. Gradually, the impossible maneuver stopped looking impossible. It started looking practical. The raid began just before sunrise. Mist still hung across the edges of the airfield when the sirens started screaming through the cold morning air. Ground crews froze for half a second, recognizing the sound before instinct took over. Men dropped tools and sprinted toward shelters. Pilots abandoned mugs of tea inside the operations hut and ran for their aircraft. Nobody needed orders anymore. At RAF Manston, survival had become muscle memory. Far overhead came the low mechanical drone of approaching engines. German bombers crossing the channel. Possibly Dornier Do-17s. Maybe Heinkel He-111s. The exact type hardly mattered. Bombs falling onto a runway looked the same regardless of which aircraft delivered them. Flight Officer James Harlow reached his Spitfire first. 23 years old. 32 combat sorties already behind him. Thin, sharp-faced, permanently exhausted in the way fighter pilots often became after surviving too long. He had practiced Townsend's maneuver 4 times. He still didn't entirely trust it. But trust was secondary now. The bombs were coming whether he trusted the idea or not. Harlow climbed into the cockpit without fully fastening his harness. No time. The starter engaged. The Merlin engine coughed violently before roaring alive beneath him. The whole aircraft trembled with restrained force. Outside the cockpit canopy, mechanics were still running for cover. The bombers were close. Very close. Under normal procedure, Harlow would taxi forward toward the far end of the strip before beginning his takeoff roll. That process consumed precious seconds. Seconds spent exposed and motionless while enemy aircraft aligned overhead. Instead, he immediately tapped the rudder and released pressure on the brake. The Spitfire rolled backward across the uneven ground. 15 yards. 20. Brake. Pivot. Throttle. The fighter swung around sharply, nose snapping toward the runway centerline. Then Harlow pushed the throttle fully forward. The aircraft exploded into motion. Acceleration felt violent compared to a standard launch. The tail rose almost immediately as the aircraft clawed for speed over the damaged surface. 40 knots. 50. 60. Behind him, the first bombs hit. The southern edge of the airfield erupted in dirt, smoke, and shattered concrete. Shockwaves rolled across the runway. Fragments screamed through the mist like invisible blades. Harlow never looked back. At 70 knots, he pulled gently on the stick. The Spitfire lifted clear of the ground just as another explosion ripped across the place where he would have been seconds earlier under the normal launch procedure. 2 more fighters followed him into the air. Both used Townsend's reverse maneuver. Both escaped. A 4th pilot attempted a conventional takeoff from the opposite end of the strip. He accelerated normally down the runway while the German bombs walked steadily across the airfield. Halfway through the roll, a bomb exploded 30 yards from the aircraft. The concussion lifted the fighter sideways like a toy. Fuel ignited instantly. Ground crews later found only fragments of wreckage scattered across the cratered concrete. But Harlow and the others were already climbing through 2,000 feet above the field. Alive, the raid lasted less than 5 minutes. When the smoke finally cleared, 3 aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. But 3 others had escaped because of Townsend's maneuver. Not in theory, not in training. In combat. Under bombardment. Exactly where the calculations said it would matter most. Wing Commander Verity reviewed the incident report personally. He examined takeoff times, bomb impact locations, pilot statements, damage assessments. He did not need statisticians or analysts to explain what had happened. The reverse launch procedure had worked. Not perfectly, not universally, but well enough to save aircraft and crews during an active raid. That changed everything. Townsend was called into Verity's office later that afternoon. The station commander wasted no words. It's standard procedure now. Townsend nodded once. No celebration. No speeches. Both men understood the reality clearly. The maneuver would not stop the Luftwaffe from bombing Manston. It would not repair the runway. It would not end the war. It simply bought time. And sometimes time was the most valuable weapon available. News of the maneuver spread rapidly across southeastern England. Other RAF stations faced the same problems Manston did. Damaged runways. Sudden raids. Fighters destroyed before they could even leave the ground. Requests began arriving almost immediately. Could Townsend demonstrate the technique elsewhere? Could pilots from neighboring stations be trained? Could the maneuver work under different runway conditions? Verity approved the requests one after another. Soon Townsend found himself traveling between airfields carrying nothing more dramatic than diagrams, calculations, and practical instructions. At RAF Hawkinge, pilots initially dismissed the procedure as a stunt until they watched Townsend execute it personally. At RAF Biggin Hill, mechanics began painting temporary alignment markers directly onto damaged strips to help pilots judge pivot angles. Every station modified the procedure slightly, depending on terrain and aircraft type. Some pilots mastered it quickly. Others hated it. A few refused outright. One veteran squadron leader called it flying backward into hell. Townsend never argued with them. He simply showed casualty figures. Then he showed the reduced takeoff times. Most pilots changed their minds after that. By autumn 1943, the reverse launch procedure had spread across multiple RAF stations operating under heavy Luftwaffe pressure. It was no longer viewed as strange. It had become practical, routine, which, in military history, is often how important innovations disappear into the background. Once something works consistently, people stop thinking of it as innovation and start thinking of it as normal procedure. Ground crews integrated the technique into scramble drills. Pilots practiced until the movements became instinctive. Reverse, brake, pivot, throttle, lift. The sequence became muscle memory. Operational records later showed measurable results. Stations employing the shortened launch method reported noticeable reductions in aircraft destroyed during runway attacks. Not dramatic reductions. War rarely offers dramatic solutions. But enough aircraft survived to matter. Enough pilots escaped to fly again. Enough sorties launched to keep pressure on the enemy. That was victory in its own quiet way. Years later, pilots interviewed after the war often described the maneuver casually. One said it felt unnatural exactly 3 times. After that, it felt necessary. Another pilot wrote in a letter home that the technique probably saved his life, though he admitted there was no way to prove it. That uncertainty defined so much of wartime survival. No pilot ever truly knew which decisions had kept him alive and which had merely delayed fate. Ground crews remembered it differently. One mechanic later recalled watching fighters launch while bombs were still falling around them. At first, he thought the pilots had lost their minds. Then he realized the opposite was true. The maneuver worked precisely because somebody had remained calm enough to think logically while everyone else reacted emotionally. That realization stayed with him long after the war ended. The Luftwaffe continued bombing British airfields through 1943 and beyond. Runways continued to crater. Aircraft continued to burn. Pilots continued to die. But fewer died trapped halfway through takeoff. And that mattered, because survival, repeated enough times, becomes strategy. The measurable effect of Townsend's maneuver never appeared in dramatic headlines. No newspapers printed triumphant stories about reverse launches saving RAF fighters. No politicians gave speeches about runway geometry or shortened exposure times. The public never saw photographs explaining how a few seconds shaved from a takeoff roll could alter survival rates during an air raid. But operational reports noticed. And operational reports, unlike headlines, dealt in realities. Between mid-1943 and early 1944, RAF stations using the reverse launch procedure recorded fewer aircraft destroyed during scramble conditions under bombardment. The reduction was not enormous. Roughly 14% across the fields where the maneuver became common practice. 14% sounds small until translated into human terms. 14% meant dozens of aircraft preserved, hundreds of combat sorties still flown. Pilots who returned home instead of burning alive halfway down a cratered runway. War is often decided through accumulation rather than spectacle. Small advantages repeated over months become strategic shifts. Tiny efficiencies compound into survival. Townsend understood this instinctively. He never described the maneuver as revolutionary because he knew revolutions attract attention. Attention creates resistance. Resistance slows adoption. Instead, he presented the idea as practical, temporary, merely another tool available to pilots operating under difficult conditions. That humility probably ensured its survival. The procedure continued evolving after wider implementation. Engineers studied optimal pivot angles depending on aircraft type and runway condition. Ground crews experimented with painted alignment guides to help pilots maintain orientation during nighttime scrambles. Mechanics refined throttle recommendations to reduce wheel spin on damaged surfaces. The maneuver itself remained simple. Reverse, pivot, accelerate, lift. But simplicity in aviation often hides enormous complexity beneath it. A successful reverse launch required pilots to balance momentum, rudder control, throttle response, and surface friction simultaneously while under combat stress. The timing window remained narrow. Hesitation ruined the maneuver. Overcorrection could send the aircraft sideways across the strip. Pilots practiced repeatedly until the sequence became instinctive. Because instinct is what remains after fear overwhelms conscious thought. And fear was everywhere on those airfields. RAF stations across southeastern England existed in a state of constant anticipation. The next raid could come at dawn, or dusk, or during lunch. Pilots learned to sleep lightly with boots beside their bunks. Mechanics learned to repair aircraft faster than replacement parts arrived. Everyone on the station developed an intimate relationship with the warning sirens. That sound changed people. At first it triggered panic. Later it triggered motion. Pure automatic motion. Run. Start engines. Move aircraft. Launch if possible. Survive if lucky. One former pilot later described the atmosphere at Manston as living permanently inside the first 30 seconds of a disaster. That description was not exaggerated, because the most dangerous moments of an air raid were rarely the explosions themselves. It was the time immediately before them, the uncertainty, the race against invisible aircraft approaching through cloud cover. Townsend's maneuver shortened that race. Nothing more, nothing less. The technique gradually spread beyond emergency scramble procedures. Military engineers examining short-field operations after the war studied similar principles while designing rapid deployment systems for tactical aviation. Carrier launch philosophy evolved around minimizing vulnerable transition phases. Helicopter assault doctrine later incorporated comparable concepts involving prepositioning and compressed launch timing. Very few instructors teaching those systems knew where the ideas originated. Fewer still remembered Townsend's role. That anonymity would not have troubled him. He was never interested in becoming famous, only useful. Peter Townsend continued serving throughout the war. He flew combat missions across multiple theaters and eventually rose to the rank of group captain. Decorations followed. Promotions followed. Responsibility followed. But whenever people later asked him about the reverse launch procedure, he consistently dismissed it as common sense. Not brilliance. Not invention. Common sense applied under pressure. That answer revealed something important about him. Genuine innovators rarely view themselves as innovators while they are working. They simply see a problem that requires solving. Everything else becomes secondary. After the war, Townsend's public reputation shifted unexpectedly. His personal relationship with Princess Margaret drew enormous media attention throughout the 1950s. Suddenly, newspapers cared less about aviation and more about romance, scandal, and royal controversy. Journalists who might once have asked about wartime improvisation now asked about palace politics. The transition frustrated many officers who had known him during the war, because they understood that the public story had become disconnected from the real one. The real Peter Townsend was not fundamentally a celebrity or romantic figure. He was a problem solver. A pilot who looked at cratered runways and dead airmen and refused to accept that tradition automatically deserved obedience. He died in 1995. Most obituaries mentioned his military decorations briefly before focusing on the royal scandal that had followed him decades earlier. Only a handful referenced the reverse launch maneuver. By then, the technique had dissolved into aviation history so completely that many assumed it had always existed. That is often how useful ideas survive, not by remaining attached to the people who created them, by becoming ordinary. The old airfield at RAF Manston eventually changed beyond recognition. The wartime scars disappeared beneath new surfaces and civilian construction. Craters filled. Temporary steel repairs vanished beneath modern pavement. The roar of Merlin engines gave way to quieter sounds. But history leaves traces even after the physical evidence disappears. Stand there long enough on a gray morning with wind moving in from the sea, and it becomes possible to imagine it again. The mist, the sirens, ground crews sprinting through mud, fighters scattered across damaged concrete, a young pilot inside a Spitfire rolling backward while bombs fall somewhere beyond the cloud cover. Not because he wants to look clever, not because he is reckless, because mathematics says this gives him a slightly better chance of surviving the next 30 seconds. And in war, a slightly better chance can become the dividing line between life and death. That is the real legacy of Townsend's maneuver. Not spectacle, not heroics. Precision, adaptation, the willingness to challenge procedures that no longer matched reality. Military doctrine often hardens into ritual. People repeat actions because those actions have always been repeated. Townsend questioned that instinct at exactly the right moment. He understood that survival sometimes requires violating expectations. Sometimes the safest direction forward begins with moving backward first. There is a photograph of Townsend taken late in the war. He stands beside a weathered Supermarine Spitfire with his hands in his pockets, squinting toward the sun. The aircraft behind him is scarred from combat. Patchwork repairs run across the fuselage. Oil stains mark the panels beneath the engine cowling. Nothing about the image appears extraordinary. No dramatic pose. No triumphant expression. Just another RAF officer beside another damaged fighter during another exhausting year of war. But hidden inside that ordinary image is the story itself. A man surrounded by destruction who looked at catastrophe and responded not with panic, but with curiosity. A pilot who understood that innovation is rarely loud. Sometimes it arrives quietly, as a sketch in a notebook, a calculation on damaged concrete, a fighter rolling backward before racing into the sky. And somewhere beyond the mathematics and mechanics lies the deeper truth Townsend probably understood better than most. Survival in war rarely belongs to the strongest people. It belongs to the people willing to adapt before everyone else realizes adaptation is necessary. That was the hidden genius, not the maneuver itself. The willingness to imagine it in the first place.